So if you're listening to this from home, chances are you're working. A Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas report found that of all those employed in May, 35.2% worked entirely from home, compared to just 8.2% in February. Further, a whopping 71.7% of U.S. workers who could work from home did so in May. So clearly, things are changing. And today I want to talk a little bit about what that means for your taxes and your bottom line. First off, things that we know. One, just because you're home doesn't change your employment status. If you were an employee at your office and you're doing the same work now, just from a different location, you're still an employee. Just because you're at home now doesn't make you a gig worker. It doesn't make you a freelancer. It doesn't make you an independent contractor. Why does it matter whether you're an employee or an independent contractor? Well, for one, it affects your bottom line in terms of tax and withholding. But even more important, it affects your ability to take deductions and credits on your tax return. And one that a lot of people are talking about these days is the home office deduction. Now, it used to be back in the day, you could deduct the expenses that were related to working from home. But now, in a post-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act world, that's no longer the case. Because of the TCJA, from 2018 to 2025, if you're an employee, you are no longer eligible to claim the home office deduction. Now, this has been the case for a couple years now because we're in 2020, but nobody cared in 2018 and 2019, but they care now because they're home. It's particularly interesting because people assume that because the world is different and because your employer is forcing you to be at home during this time, that there's a rule or a waiver that might apply that made the home office deduction applicable now, but that's not the case. So how can you get around this? My first piece of advice is to ask your employer if you can take some things from the office. So I know that feels kind of sketchy because those things are in another place and belong to another person. But if you have a chair that really works for you, or if you really like the computer monitor at your office, why not ask your employer if you can take those things home? You're not keeping them, you're just borrowing them, but that saves you money and it saves the employer money. My second piece of advice, ask about reimbursement policies. A lot of us forget that those exist, but for a lot of corporations, especially bigger corporations, there are stipends available for cell phone use. There may be reimbursement policies for small purchases for office supplies. So it may be that money that you're spending out of pocket can come back to you from the company, and that saves you money since you are no longer entitled to the tax deduction. So those things are settled, but there are some things that remain unsettled when it comes to tax. And believe it or not, one of them may be where you're subject to tax. There is no federal standard for withholding or taxation from state to state. So the rules may be very different for where you work versus where you live. And in some cases, you may be subject to tax in both states. Typically, you first file and report income in the state where you work, and then you claim a tax credit for that income tax that you paid in the state where you live. It's important to get the order right because if you don't and you mix them up, you may miss out on the credit, which means that you may end up paying more tax, or you may miss out on a refund. Where it gets more complicated is if you've been working in one state where the company is located for part of the year, and now you're working where you live for another part of the year. Figuring out that split can be difficult. It's even more difficult because states, even neighboring states, may have different tests. Some of them may have what's called physical presence tests, where they literally count the number of days that you're in the state where you're working. And then others have tests that depend on where the company is located. But now, when we may be working in a different state than we have been before, it can be tricky. So my recommendation, first of all, is to ask questions, check your withholding, find out which state your employer is taking withholding from, because that matters. Keep great records, especially from where you're working, like the location that you're working. It can be difficult to figure out withholding and taxation from state to state on your own, but a good tax professional ought to be able to help. If you ask now, you can also be prepared so that you don't have any tax surprises come tax day.